This time I was stronger and a bit braver. I decided I would rather die than put up with their harassment. I kept up, even though I wanted to go home. On Sundays we were told that we had to attend all-day campouts. They featured Nordic tales and pagan rites. This tied in with the Nordic archaeological dig nearby that we were told contained our Viking ancestors. The Viking settlement of Hythabu, near Schleswig, was being slowly unearthed. School children were taken on field trips to learn about this 2,000-year-old trading centre. Just one Viking boat was on display at that time. When I visited it 30 years later, the complete site had been excavated and the relics were housed in a museum on the site. Known only for their seafaring piracy, archaeologists discovered that the Vikings had a highly developed civilization with its own written language. Among the relics in the museum were metal crosses and communion chalices. The Viking settlement was Christian. Wouldn't that have surprised the Nazis? Along with their pagan religious teachings, we were given new racial teachings. They attempted to elevate us as Nordic men and to convince us that we were a superior breed. The Germanic, meaning our blonde, blue-eyed northern peers, and Dinaric, the brunette, brown-eyed southern Germans, were supposedly a race of supermen. They arranged heathen celebrations of summer and winter solstices for boys. We were supposed to jump over bonfires and sing songs written just for the Hitler Youth, anti-Christian and anti-Jewish songs. I only remember one. Called Sharpen the Long Knives, it was particularly gruesome. Life became more and more militant. A draft was established and the Air Force was created. The Versailles Treaty had allowed neither. On Sunday afternoons, my family kept up by reading the paper and listening to the news. By March 1938, my father had gotten so excited over the news that he was dropping tobacco and ashes all over the dining room table. He told me that Germany took over Austria, Hitler's homeland, occupied it under the name Anschluss, and made it a part of Germany under the name of Ostmark. Papa hauled out his atlas and showed me the area. The following May, Dad nervously showered ashes over the pages of his atlas, while he pointed out a new territory that we had gained. He told me that turmoil in the Sudeten region of Czechoslovakia forced that country to cede to Germany an area in which many ethnic Germans lived. It had never been a part of Germany, but had been a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which collapsed in 1918. Papa said, "Hitler is proving that he is capable of carrying out his plans for expansion. He is asking for the full support of every German and every Allied nation." Supporting Hitler transformed my childhood into further tedium and discomfort. On top of compulsory attendance in the brown shirts, attendance was mandatory at marches and assemblies held on public holidays, such as April 20th, Hitler's birthday, January 30th, taking over power, May 1st, Day of German Labour, and so on. The 1st of May is always cold and rainy on the north coast. What is the Führer thinking when he says the boys have to change into summer uniforms today? Mother was convinced I was too frail for this. She feared I would catch pneumonia. From his warm nest in southern Germany, Hitler had decreed May 1st to be the day when youth organizations switched from the winter uniform of black ski pants, shirts, jackets and caps, with protective neck and ear flaps, to a skimpy uniform of black shorts and brown shirts. I rushed out the door to hop up and down with other freezing boys trying to keep warm as we waited for a streetcar headed to the city square. Lined up for another assembly, the boys around me looked blue and blotchy. We couldn't stop shivering as party bigwigs took their turns in the limelight. I hoped that Hitler wouldn't decide to speak to the nation. On that cold day, and many following days, his speeches were broadcast over loudspeakers while we stood in formation in a cold wind that blew over our bare legs and arms. His high-pitched voice spieled on and on. He shouted, "I have lifted Germany out of misery. I promise you a brighter future, a greater Germany." At every assembly, I prayed for the finale. Why can't we go home and play? I thought. Marching and standing in formation were barely tolerable, but the intolerable happened one night when some stormtroopers appeared and barked at my father. "Leave your post and go directly home. We'll complete your shift." Father came bounding up the stairs looking puzzled. "I wonder what's going on?" he asked as he switched on the radio. That night we heard a report about the assassination of von Rath, a German embassy official in Paris, allegedly by a Jew. That was all the stormtroopers needed. They burned down the synagogue, broke windows of Jewish-owned stores, and looted the contents. My family had shopped at those stores for years and exchanged pleasantries with the owners. The intimidation of Jewish owners and the smashing of all that glass gave this night the infamous name Crystal Night. The next day, when my mother and I went downtown to go shopping, there was still glass all over the streets, and stormtroopers were holding signs. "Germans, don't buy from Jews." It became mandatory for Jews to wear an armband with the Star of David. By that time, nearly everyone in Germany, including children, was easily identified, either by uniforms or armbands. News of Germany's prosperity encouraged many German immigrants in America to return. By the time the first of them arrived, butter was already being rationed, and other items were soon included. Each person was given a certain number of coupons per month for items such as butter, sugar, meat, and so on, according to their caloric requirements. We could buy no more than what we were allotted. Radio broadcasts told us that we should be glad to make this little sacrifice in order to feed our brave soldiers. Among the first returnees was a family who moved into a building next door. Their 2 boys had been born in the United States and spoke very little German. When they saw me in my young folk uniform, they shouted, "Hey, hey, Nazi boy!" My father thought this was funny. Me, of all people. My father tried to explain rationing to me as he lit up a cigarette. He had read that cigarettes would soon be rationed, and he knew he would have to cut down on his smoking. Then he got serious about the world scene. He explained the latest turmoil. Nazis made problems again in Czechoslovakia. He pointed to that country in his atlas. He said, through a cloud of smoke, "They're having a peace conference in Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain retreat." He pointed out that place in his atlas too. Leaders of Germany, Italy, France, and Britain participated. Hitler impressed Prime Minister Chamberlain of Britain, who returned home and proclaimed in a speech, "Peace in our time." His speech was translated and broadcast in Germany. The following day, I sat by the radio with my uncle. He listened and let out a series of sighs. He asked me for my geography book, pointed to 4 countries, and tried to explain what was happening. As a result of the so-called peace conference, Czechoslovakia has ceased to exist. It is now a protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Slovakia is a German satellite. This isn't fair to those countries, he said, as he got up and went to his room. For a 10-year-old, it was hard to keep up. My geography book was out of date. Finally, the Spanish Civil War ended with a victory by the nationalists, the Franco regime and Falange, Spanish fascists. My father, puffing clouds of smoke, showed me newspaper photos of the German Legion Condor. I wanted to see if Heinz was in it, but it was impossible to tell. The Legion Condor, who had been there unofficially, was now officially revealed to the world by the media as German soldiers goose-stepped through Madrid in a victory parade. Spain heaped accolades on Germany and remained loyal but neutral throughout the next war, World War II. "Ach, goose-stepping!" said Uncle Hanny when he saw the article. "Who are the Nazis trying to impress?" His humour masked a storm gathering strength to engulf us. As we got older and my sister Erica and I became teenagers, Mother gave us more responsibility. My sister helped take care of our apartment and the food purchasing, and I worked in the shop where shoes were made and sold. Eventually, they trusted me to purchase their materials at a low price wholesale so that they made a profit. When these materials became rationed, I had to be watchful in order to get everything our coupons allowed. In order to handle our grown-up responsibilities, Erica and I had the run of Kiel, a most unusual city. My father had told me that although Schleswig was once the capital of Schleswig-Holstein, our hometown had grown rapidly as a Prussian naval city, and later as an imperial naval port on the Baltic. He said that Kiel had grown even more at the end of World War I. The German Revolution began in 1918, with the mutiny of the fleet and the hoisting of the red flags. Our city became the capital after the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. The tides and weather of the Baltic were part of our rhythm. Built along a huge natural bay, our city extended along both sides. We could cross the city on ferries or go the long way around by streetcar or on our bikes. The middle class, to which we belonged, as well as the lower working classes, lived in apartment buildings. The upper class had houses, and the aristocrats lived in mansions on large estates. Class divisions were unimportant to me, except that I would have liked to have the privilege of a college education. By August of 1939, I was able to discuss the latest news with my father or my uncle. The Soviet Union and Germany had just signed a non-aggression pact. "Finally," said Uncle Honey, "some good news for a change." "Now we shouldn't have to deal with an invasion from Russia," I said. "This is really great." But by September, Hitler was on the radio, screaming, "My Uncle Hani and I heard him describe the fight." "This can lead to no good," Uncle said, shaking his head and breathing hard. I was afraid he was going to have an asthma attack. He whispered between coughs, "I have never believed anything Hitler says. You realize that World War II has unofficially begun, don't you?" he said, as his eyes searched my face for a reaction. He reached out and touched my shoulder, too choked up to go on. News from abroad became ever more threatening. France and Great Britain demanded that Germany immediately stop hostilities and withdraw from Poland, or war would follow. Hitler ignored them. After seeing these threats underplayed by the media, Uncle Hani said, "Hitler feels so powerful that he doesn't believe that the West will take a stand against his expansion of territory. He is very, very wrong." Was the headline September 3rd, 1939. By the 17th, my father ran upstairs with the daily newspaper under his arm. Divide and Conquer was the name of the game. Breathing hard, he shakily spread it out with a shower of cigarette sparks. He pointed out that the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. Germany and the Soviet Union divided Poland between themselves. "My God in heaven," he said, "we're going to be bombed for sure." Within a few weeks we heard the engines of the Royal Air Force, RAF, coming our way. They dropped leaflets with a caricature of Stalin and the moustached Hitler captioned, "The Only Difference." Stalin, of course, was a communist. Erica and I ran outside to grab some to show our mother. Mother struggled to say the right thing. "These were dropped to scare us." Uncle Hani took a look at the leaflets and looked glum. "Ah!" he snorted and retreated to his room. The paper drop did not last. Bombs followed. Block captains showed us how to make blackouts every night, so that no light would show pilots where the city lay. We covered every window with black paper. The block captains checked their neighborhoods for any cracks of light showing through. Tenants of every building had to take precautions against incendiary bombs, primarily in the attics under the terracotta tile roofs. Sand and water were stored up there to extinguish these small bombs, which set fires on impact. Every apartment building had to have interfacing walls broken out in order to connect the buildings. This would provide an escape route if the building collapsed. Sealed metal doors were installed in case of gas attacks. The entire population was issued gas masks. During my 15th year, British night attacks against Kiel intensified. Our ships attracted them like magnets. Drums that released artificial fog were set up on both sides of Kiel Harbour. There were red alerts and yellow alerts. At yellow alert, enemy planes headed in this direction. They released the fog. However, it was impossible to artificially fog such a massive harbour. The shipyards and naval installations and submarine bases were all situated at the harbour's edge. The loud, boastful statement of Hermann Goering, head of the German Air Force, became a standing joke. His troops were commonly referred to as the Hermann Meyer forces. There was far more teasing than anyone today might believe. Everyone made jokes at the Air Force's expense. "So, you are one of Hermann Meyer's men." They could only smile back. Britain's Royal Air Force gave us headaches. Our family was somewhat relieved when Erica graduated and was assigned to a year on the land. This was Nazi egalitarianism. City kids were supposed to live and work in the country for a year and experience the life of farm kids. In actuality, the Nazis needed the strength of girls and women to substitute for all the farmers they had sent off to war. We missed Erica, but we kept telling each other that she would be safer. Still in school, I was assigned to air raid defence. On duty as an air raid defence boy, I had to stay up all night sometimes to assist during raids. Off duty, I was so tired that air raid sirens couldn't wake me up. When sirens shrieked, everyone was supposed to hurry down to the basement. My mother had her hands full. She would have to shake me awake and plead with me to go down to the basement. Then she had to help Uncle Hanny down 4 flights of pitch-black stairs. "Ugh!" he would protest. "Don't push me!" At the first hint of bombings, Mother decided what was essential and had it at her fingertips. She never went anywhere without our documents. We would sit in the dimness with a few candles, praying that our building wouldn't get hit and collapse on top of us. One day we got downstairs just in time to hear a heart-stopping blast and feel a giant concussion. The whole building shook. We grabbed each other's hands, ducked down with our heads together. At least we could die together. "Why? Why do we have to suffer so?" Uncle Hannah said. "Hush, honey. The neighbours will hear you," Mother said. The building ceased trembling. What a tremendous bomb! We waited until the all-clear siren went off before climbing up to survey the damage. "The stairway is clear!" someone shouted. "Let's get out of here," I yelled. "I can't stand to look," Uncle Hanny said. "What did any of us do to deserve this?" The blockbuster had landed in the street and had destroyed half of our building. Although our own apartment was intact, the windows were smashed and debris was everywhere. Mother used brushes instead of dust cloths for house cleaning. Her brushes worked better than anything else to clean up shards of glass and hunks of plaster. We nailed blankets over the windows. From then on, we camped indoors. The blockbuster had knocked out the water main, electricity and gas, exactly as intended. A few weeks later, we were invited to move in with a family from Sudeten, who had previously lived in the building and now lived in a dasher-like cottage called a settler house in a new suburb. Small individual houses with small plots of land to raise vegetables, chickens and even a pig were the Nazi idea of a dream for the people. The new place was quite a distance from the end of the streetcar line. With the addition of our family, the household was doubled up and crowded, but it was much safer than our apartment in Kiel. I hated being a permanent guest in someone else's house. I was secretly glad that I had been joined into the Rapid Commandos, a quick reaction force of the air raid defence, which lived in local police stations. I visited my family in the afternoons. My mother could not stop worrying about me. Slow to mature physically, I still looked like a little boy. Yet my job was to pull injured and dead people out from under buildings collapsed from bombs and to put out minor fires. We had many yellow alerts that did not turn into the red alerts, which meant an actual air raid on Kiel. The general population was unaware of such alerts. Although we had men's jobs, we were still immature and up to pranks. My friend Paul Schultz and I used yellow alerts to our advantage if we wanted to go to school late. We deepened our voices to call in for each other, pretending to be officials granting excuses. "Hello, Officer Schultz here," Paul would say. "Erickson won't be in until 10 this morning. His unit was on duty all night." Then we'd crack up and laugh so hard that Paul's face would turn red. His hair, eyebrows and eyelashes were so white that he looked like a junior St. Nicholas. We had been issued new uniforms consisting of a hodgepodge of former Dutch Army uniforms with German Air Force grey caps. This helped us gain entry into movie theatres for military discounts and to try to avoid age restrictions on grown-up movies. Uniforms seemed to make everyone feel more important. My father's dark blue police uniform had looked perfectly adequate, but when I saw him on the street one day, I thought he had become the police chief. His position had not changed, but he and all of his fellow officers were brilliantly attired in green uniforms with loops of gold braid, epaulets, multicoloured ribbons and badges. It would have taken a catalogue to figure out all the uniforms worn in Germany at that time, but everyone was frightened of the SS and recognised them immediately. The infamous Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, was also the head of the German police and the Gestapo, the secret state police. Himmler had decked out the police force in dark green. He geared the outfit he chose for his general SS to overawe the citizenry: black trousers, brown shirts, black jackets, and black jackboots. People dreaded the Gestapo more, even though they didn't wear uniforms. They went about their insidious business like wolves in sheep's clothing. Richard Briggs, an American Army veteran, told me how confused they were about all the German uniforms. The event occurred sometime in mid-March 1945, on the outskirts of Cologne. We could see the steeple of the famous cathedral in the distance. I was an 18-year-old private in the 86th Black Hawk Infantry Division. We were on the front lines. My sergeant sent me to the rear to do something, I forget what, but as I was passing a small cottage in a wooded area, I saw an older man in the most beautiful uniform I had ever seen. There was braid all over it. I thought he must surely have been a German admiral or something, so I took him prisoner. I searched him, found him unarmed, and proceeded to march him to the rear with his arms over his head. From there, I had to march him several miles to a tent at our battalion headquarters to be interrogated by our colonel. It was only seconds until the colonel popped out of the tent and shouted, "Where is that dumb GI that brought the German admiral in here? He's no German admiral. He's a streetcar conductor." Needless to say, I was the laughingstock of my company then, and I still am when we veterans meet today, 54 years later. Our rapid commando uniforms didn't make life easier for us either. Youth leaders often checked for IDs at movie entrances. They wouldn't let us into adult movies. Youth leader patrols could check identification and had police power over children under 18 unless they were already in the military. I was perplexed by the rules. Weren't they already treating us like adults? My 15-year-old buddies and I were forced to dig bodies out of caved-in buildings and extinguish fires, yet we were prevented from seeing romances on the screen. Bombs falling on German cities did not deter Hitler from his plans to conquer more territories. In 1940, just before I turned 16, he announced over the radio, "Germany has invaded neutral Denmark as well as Norway. Due to Dutch resistance, the Luftwaffe is attacking Rotterdam. The Netherlands will soon be ours." Belgium was invaded in order to attack the Maginot Line, a connected line of fortifications in France from the rear since their guns were facing only one way. Germany defeated France, which surrendered that June. Germany occupied the northern half, and Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain governed from Vichy and served the Nazi overlords. My family gave me a 16th birthday party at the house in the country. We had so little time together that we clung to one another that night and feasted on food Mother had scrounged together. She even managed to give me a cake with candles and wrapped a present for me. When I tore it open, I found an expensive Swiss watch. "Don't get sentimental over this," my dad said. "Now you won't have an excuse for being late." "I'm never late," I protested. "People complain that I'm always too early." "Like father, like son," my father said with a proud smile. My uncle didn't say a word when I unwrapped the leather wallet full of money that he gave me. "Tomorrow," said my ever-practical mother, "I'll help you open a postal savings account. You never know when money might come in handy for an emergency." That was fine with me. The partners had taught me thrift and how to spend money wisely. They were both conscientious bookkeepers, proud of the fact that they had taught me how to manage money. They could not say the same for my father. He aggravated them every time he wanted to buy something. Instead of asking for a certain amount, he just opened the cash register and took out a fistful of marks. Neither my uncle nor my mother wished to confront him. Instead, they showed me what a mess it made of their system and used it for one more of my learning experiences. In the midst of alerts, bombs, and emergencies, children went to school and grown-ups went to work. After graduating from a boys' middle school, I went to a boys' commercial school, where I was being trained in the wholesale business. We took it for granted. Our lives were a continuous round of school and work punctuated by air raids and danger. Although I no longer lived at home, I had no freedom to socialize, nor did anyone else my age. In normal times, parents would plan parties and dances where 16-year-old boys and girls could meet. I'm sure that everyone felt like I did. Our lives were in suspension. Besides the normal 3 R's, I attended classes in English, accounting, and history, Nazi style. We had already learned that there had been 3 Reichs, or empires. The first was Charlemagne's, the second was Bismarck's, the third was Hitler's Germany. A favourite teacher's question was, "How long will the Third Reich last?" The correct answer, 1,000 years. By April 1941, Hitler gloated over his conquests in every speech. He announced that Germany had attacked Yugoslavia and Greece. By June, he told us, Germany has attacked the Soviet Union with the allied countries of Finland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. After massive attacks caught the Soviet Union unprepared, the German offensive froze up at Leningrad and at Moscow. German forces were unprepared and ill-equipped for the severe Russian winter. Undismayed, Hitler was on the radio in December saying, "Germany has declared war on the United States of America after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii." I was sitting with Uncle Hani at the shoe store, smoking a forbidden cigarette and discussing these new developments. "This is going to be the end of Germany," my Uncle Hani said, holding his head in his hands. Then he put his arm around my shoulders. Neither of us could have guessed how badly it would end, especially for him. By May of 1942, I was drafted into the German army at Ratzeburg. With the invincibility of youth, I said goodbye to my family. They gathered round and tried their best to be positive. My father took a look at my belt buckle and expounded on one of the many ironies and controversies of Nazism and religion. "Did you ever compare your belt buckle to the one the SS wears?" Our belt buckles in the army were embossed with a German eagle clutching the swastika and surrounded by the words "Gott mit uns," meaning God was with us. This differed from the belt buckles of the Waffen-SS, or military units of the SS, whose inscription was "Blood and Honour." "No," I said, "I don't understand it." "The Nazis suppress Christianity, but you have a God-fearing belt buckle. But more importantly, the Army, Navy and Air Force have Lutheran and Catholic chaplains," my father said. "They'll be there when you need them." The 2 religious groups were recognized as state churches. My father went on to say that the Vatican had signed a concordat with the Nazis in July of 1933 for the Roman Catholic Church in Germany. Father added that the basic idea was, "You stay out of our church and we stay out of your politics." Unfortunately, the concordat did not protect the Roman Catholics for long, nor were the Lutherans protected. My parents paid close attention to what happened next. The Evangelical Lutheran Church, governed within the states, did not have a strong national organization. The Nazis tried to wrest control by appointing a Nazi bishop. At that point, the Lutheran Church splintered into 2, a confessing church and the Evangelical Lutheran Church. The confessing church opposed the Nazi doctrine. Pastor Bonhoeffer bravely led the confessing church until he was arrested and executed. Another Lutheran, Martin Niemöller, a World War I submarine captain and later a Lutheran minister, took over the leadership and ended up in a concentration camp for his resistance to Hitler. Our family discussed these issues and silently prayed for the souls of the pastors. Suddenly, I was on my family's prayer roster too. Their entreaties surrounded me with love on my 50-mile trip to Army basic training in Tonda, Denmark, the catapult to far-off theatres of war. The war that Hitler started in Poland had spread through 61 countries on 4 continents before ending 6 years later, with 50 million people dead. I was lost in thought until the bus jerked and jolted over potholes and around piles of debris. Fog had rolled in and descended in a cold haze. An icy chill seized me as I wiped off a spot on my window and laid eyes on a grey, rubble-covered city. May recruit in basic training, Tonda, Denmark. June 1942, taking the oath with platoon. Eriksson is 3rd from left, top row. In Denmark as recruit at age 18. Eriksson is in middle row on left end, in full official Afrika Korps tropical uniform prior to capture in Tunisia, North Africa, at 18¾ years old. Interior of Okba Mosque at Kairouan, Tunisia. Photos by Kirk Erickson, 1997. Exterior of Okba, reputed by Muslims to be one of the 4 gates to paradise. Photo of Field Marshal Rommel from Patton Museum, Fort Knox, Kentucky. German Nebelwerfer 6-barreled rocket launcher in Tunisia. German Tiger tank, Patton Museum, Fort Knox, Kentucky. German gear of the Africa Corps, Patton Museum, Fort Knox, Kentucky. German 88mm anti-aircraft gun, Patton Museum, Fort Knox, Kentucky. Official POW photo, Hearne, Texas. First POW collection point in Tunisia, May 1943. Replica of a German castle built by non-commissioned officer POWs at Hearne, Texas. Photo from Texas A&M University. Arrival in German uniform at Camp Hearne, Texas, autumn 1943. POWs at the castle, 1944. John Waters, Texas A&M professor, working on excavation at Camp Hearne. Photo by Kirk Erickson, 1997. Graves of German POWs at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Grave of Ernst Schlotter, killed November 5, 1944. Grave of Fritz Wolff, killed November 5, 1944. Drawing from POW sketchbook, Fort Knox, Kentucky, front gate. Drawing of barracks, caricature of POW stencils. German script in a diary of a POW at Hearne, Texas. Erickson with his sister Erica, Christmas 1928. Grade school 1933. Adolescence 1938. At age 15 with mother, Ellie Erickson, 1939. Erickson, from behind, as interpreter for Count von Luckner, famous War raider captain and British delegation. Remnants of Remagen Bridge, the only bridge Germany failed to blow up. It allowed American troops to cross the Rhine River. Then explosives were set. German and American flags fly on the ruins. Erickson as interpreter, centre, with delegation from Coventry, England, returning from a regatta. During Kiel Week, as interpreter for a British delegation. Kiel Railroad Station with adjacent church, 1947. With less than half of its housing left standing, Kiel made room for repatriated soldiers, refugees and displaced persons. Kiel Street scene, 1947. City rubble dug and shoveled by hand onto small track train for disposal into the sea. Erickson's boss, Group Captain RAF, RTD. Thompson, the British resident officer, Kiel. Ruined arch of a Lutheran church. Many churches were never restored. At some sites, arches or facades were left standing as testimonials. Kiel, 1947. Sapper at work. Not every bomb that dropped exploded. City officials located them and had them disarmed. Salvaging Walpout 2 U-boat, Kiel Harbour, 1949. Marshall Plan money replaces Quonset huts with new buildings. First post-war German naval submarine under NATO, 1956. Ericsson's wife, Jean, with his father in Germany, 1967. Ericsson's parents on carriage ride through the beautiful German heather, or Lüneburger Heide, 1967. Ericsson's parents' last resting place. Ericsson's father's retirement from the police force after 25 years. Heino and Jean's wedding day, Minnesota, 1963. With all of their children, Texas, 1985. Readoption day for twins, Minnesota, 1975. Annual ceremony at gravesites of German POWs, Memorial Day, Fort Knox, 1997. With Staff Sergeant Lobsinger, military editor of Inside the Turret, Fort Knox, December 1997. Revisiting Fort Knox, December 1997, with German liaison officer Lieutenant Colonel Myers. The second family at a Los Niños International Family Celebration at Del Lago, Texas, 1997. Upper left to right, Kirk, Heino, Omar. Lower left to right, Tatiana, Jean and Rosanna. Heino and Jean with children adopted through child placing agreements made by Ericsson in developing countries. Del Lago Resort, 1998. The occupation, a conglomerate of the victorious countries of England, France, the Soviet Union and America, now governed Germany. They adjudicated boundaries to divide Europe and later called it the Iron Curtain. The curtains stretched from the Baltic Sea across Germany. Then the Soviets built the Berlin Wall that split the city into eastern and western sectors and formed a barricade between neighborhoods and families. Relatives were no longer able to see each other. The state of Schleswig-Holstein and the city of Kiel fell on the western side and were governed by the British. The postal bus carrying me home thumped over ruts into Kiel. When the driver announced my stop, Ellerbecker marked, I hopped off, totally discombobulated. I could just as well have been on the moon. Where was the cross and belfry of the church? Where were all the linden trees? Piles of rubble lay everywhere. 18 large-scale carpet bombings had pulverized more than 58% of all dwellings. Here was the result of that debacle. As I stumbled through the jagged mass of bricks and concrete, I felt as if I danced a requiem for the souls beneath. When I got my bearings, I started thinking about letters my mother had written as I walked to our family's apartment. She had brought me up to date during my last year of captivity. Her letters were always upbeat, regardless of how bad things were at home. She told me that the apartment by the harbour that they moved to from the country was also bombed. Thanks be to God, she wrote. About 3/4 of the building is still standing, although all of the glass windows were shattered. When your tall Uncle Hans came to see us, he vaulted right through the living room window. We were so happy to see him. Hans says he spent most of his army service on the island of Crete until the surrender. Unlike you, he was only a POW for a few months. Hans helped me locate sheets of plexiglass and he nailed it in the window frames. As I walked, I could hear the fluttering and crackling of hundreds of synthetic windows in the wind. Every building and every tree I passed bore scars of war. Streets and sidewalks were full of huge obstacles created by bombs. I had to keep dodging craters, chunks of cobbles and boulders of concrete. My heart sank. What would my parents' living conditions be like? I already knew about the prevailing food shortages. One of Mother's letters had answered my question about the food rationing. Yes, it's still very hard to get enough food. Your aunts and I share what we have. Don't worry, your father and I are all right. All we are really concerned about is you and your sister, Erica. We just wait for the happy day that you and Erica come home. Rationing did not affect my father nearly as much as it did my mother, because of his job. When he was on duty, he was served meals at the police station. For others, rationing was based on minimum, caloric needs of men, women and children, and whether or not you were working. After the family shoe shop was bombed out, their food coupons were cut down. Mother had somehow survived on her bare minimum, supplemented in the warm months with what she could grow in a plot in the backyard. When foodstuffs were available, weekly post-war rations for the average worker were 100 grams of meat, 50 grams of margarine, or butter, 150 grams of bread, about 3 spoonfuls of sugar and the same of jam, a little oil or fat, and a few potatoes. When I calculate this today, 28 grams equals 1 ounce, I realize how resourceful she was to stay alive. She had written, "Don't worry about me. The old lady across the street showed me a lot about wild plants. Your aunties and I find wild herbs and edible roots. We make tea from wild chamomile and rose hips. They're full of vitamin C, you know. We pick dandelions and other wild plants to make into salads and cook them as vegetables. The ladies and I take turns going to the fish market. One benefit of living on the Baltic Sea was that fish were not rationed, and the commercial supply not gobbled up by the government was sometimes available to Kielers. Mother had coped with air raids, malnutrition, my Uncle Hanny's depression and death, and the anxiety of not knowing whether Erica and I were alive, mistreated, or dead. My sister was in a Women's Army Corps anti-aircraft unit stationed on the island of Rügen until the Russian advance. Unknown to my parents, Erica's unit outmaneuvered the Russians and made it to Bavaria, where the Americans briefly held them as POWs. Erica was permitted to contact my mother. "Erica will be home soon," my mother wrote. The war is over for Erica, I thought. When will mine ever be over? Mother's letters were surprisingly optimistic. She never brooded about our sacrifices. She shared her worries and anxieties by visiting with a small group of relatives and neighbour women with the same uncertainties, depressions and deaths. "Even though I miss you, it is probably best that you are not here right now," she had written. From reports of POWs, I knew that Mother's life had been in constant jeopardy because the shipyards were just across the street from our apartment. Air raids with bombing and strafing planes had hit the docks day and night. When the sirens went off, she had to grab her briefcase of documents and head for one of the huge concrete bunkers built some time after I left. Mother said that Father was seldom there to help her since he worked double and even triple shifts. My father added a postscript to one of her letters. "I thought you would like to know what happened to your cousin Heinz. After Heinz came back from the Legion Condor in Spain, he was promoted. He was sent to Russia as the leader of a motorized signal unit. The unit was on its way to the front when Heinz heard over the radio that the Russians were surrounding them. 'Screw the orders,' he said. 'Let's get out of here.' They turned around and drove their signal truck back to avoid capture. Heinz never had to spend one day as a POW. He's a very lucky guy." Heinz was home safe and sound, and that was all that mattered, even if the news made me more homesick. In another letter, Mother wrote that her cousin Frida, who lived upstairs, had been pregnant. Even though I was happy for Frida, it couldn't have happened at a worse time. She gathered donations of food from friends, relatives and neighbours to get enough for the higher caloric needs of Frida. Fortunately, the pregnancy was uneventful. Medical assistance could not be counted on. Mother wrote, "When Frida's baby was born, I helped with the birth. It happened at night in an air raid bunker during a raid. There weren't any problems and the baby is normal. Her name is Elka and she has bright red hair." The infant owed her good start in life to the fact that my mother and other noble souls shared their food with her mother during the pregnancy and during the nursing period. For the rest of her life, Elka had a special place in the hearts of the close, loving relatives and neighbours who had worried over her development throughout the food shortages. She was more they ever hoped for. Elka was what they called an old soul, an exceptionally perceptive, intelligent and considerate child. Mother's midwifery and food-gathering skills were needed again later for her own daughter. She had written me a joyous letter. "Your sister finally came home, black with soot from head to toe. They sent the Women's Army unit back in coal cars." I was glad that Erica had given them something to laugh about. "All she wants right now is to find a husband, get an apartment and have a baby. Then she will feel normal," Mother wrote. Erica was 28 years old by then. Although there were few eligible men left in her age group, Erica fell in love with and married Helmut, a man twice her age, and had a baby girl, Helga, whom the family doted on. Out of the gloom, death and destruction came another healthy, happy, innocent child. Even though they were further challenged to get enough food, clothing and other basic necessities, the baby was just what they had needed to cheer them up. I was remembering her letters as I rang the doorbell. My father happened to be off duty at that moment. He answered the door. "My son! At last!" My tough father hugged me and cried. My mother heard the commotion and came running. Now we were all hugging and crying. After we calmed down a little, she said, "We have to send someone to tell Erica. We have to let her know that Heino is here." I felt a pang in my heart when I realized that I was waiting for Uncle Hanny to come out of his room. "I miss Uncle Hanny," I said. "So do I, son, every day." Mother was so gaunt that she looked 10 years older. Once she had been fashionable. Now her shabby clothes flapped around her body. She must have seen my worried glance. "Excuse the way I look. This is probably the same outfit I was wearing when you left. Garment factories stopped manufacturing years ago. I've renovated my wardrobe by taking my clothes apart, reversing them, and sewing them back together with the inside out so that the worn places don't show." She twirled around like she didn't have a care in the world. "Everybody's doing it," she said. "Right now I'm so happy I don't care, and neither should you." Regardless of the extreme food shortage, Mother had saved canned food for the day I would come home. She warmed up a vegetable stew and got me comfortable and relaxed for the first time in ages. Suddenly, a question popped into my mind. Where are my clothes? I can't stand to wear this ugly black uniform anymore. I'm sorry, they were packed in a box and torn to pieces when that bomb hit the building, she said. They wouldn't fit now anyway. You've grown much taller. I can't believe it. The clothes on my back are all I have. Will I never get out of uniform? Maybe your father knows where you can get some clothes, she said with a wink. The next day, Dad came home with a package. He had found a green policeman's raincoat to keep me dry in Keel's incessant showers. But I noticed that whenever I wore it, people thought I was with the police and shied away from me. Except for the coat, Father couldn't help me. The only clothing available was sold on the black market. I can't take you there, but I can tell you where it is, my father said with a crooked smile. I appreciated the fact that he made an exception for me, even though he had to struggle with his conscience. The shortages had brought out the worst in some Germans and the best in others, like my mother. Noble, resilient souls such as she had cooperated and shared what little they had had since the beginning of the war. For their mutual survival, they honed their bartering skills to perfection and never lost their good manners. Dishonest, selfish types who found ways to wheel and deal with the coupons and stolen goods ran the black market and hoarded items the rest of us needed. If you were upper class or wealthy, none of this mattered. You could get anything you wanted. German workers only received 100 to 150 Reichsmarks a week. Black market prices were 100 times as high as regular prices. Ironically, the unofficial currency was our former enemy's luxury product, the American cigarette. One pack equaled 100 marks. I was fascinated to finally see the black market I had heard so much about. Before we left the United States, we were allowed to send a Red Cross parcel home with coffee, cigarettes and soap, all scarce items right after the war. The packet I sent had arrived long before my return home. There it sat, holding the equivalent of a month's wages in bartering possibilities. A carton of cigarettes could be exchanged for a man's suit, if you could find a suit. Several blocks along one particular street were frequented by black marketeers who displayed their wares on cardboard or boxes. The vendors always kept a wary eye out for police raids. When police appeared, the vendors would run to doorways or into ruins, sometimes leaving their goods behind. After several strolls along the black market, I found a suit and exchanged it for a carton of cigarettes. I took it home and tried it on. Man, this thing is ugly. I hated both the colour and the fit, but anything is better than wearing a uniform. Now that my immediate need was met, I intended to take a long rest and to visit my cousins and classmates. Most of my older relatives and nephews and nieces had survived the war, but when I asked my mother about my classmates, I had a terrible shock. "Do you know if Georg is back?" I asked my mother. Georg lived in our old neighbourhood. We had gone to school together. "No, I'm sorry. I saw his mother on the street one day, and she told me that he was killed in Russia." "What about Paul? Is he back?" He and I had played a lot of silly pranks and called school with excuses for each other when we were in the civil defence. Mother looked out the window at the rain. Umbrellas bobbed up and down past the window as people walked home from work. She pulled up a chair and folded her hands in her lap. "I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but when I finally got a letter from you last year, I looked up one of your old schoolmasters, hoping for information about your classmates so that I could send you news of them. He told me that none of your classmates lived through the battles. They were sent to the Russian front, where they died from exposure or were killed. I had looked forward to seeing them again. I wanted them back. I wanted our old way of life back. Nothing was the same anymore." Mother put her arms around me. She was crying. "I had a loss that I didn't want to tell you about when you were imprisoned. My cousin Gertrude across the hall. When her husband, Anton, came home from the war, he was not himself." "What happened to him? Was he in Russia too?" I asked. "No one knows. He never told anyone what happened to him while he was gone. Anton was always such a nice man, but when he returned, he was so angry and bitter that Gertrude felt like she was living with a stranger. Anton only came home once in a while for meals." "Where did he go? Why didn't he stay home with her after she waited for him so long? No one knows that either. I could tell she was depressed. I tried everything I could think of to try to bring her around. But her marriage problems and her struggle for enough food were too much for her. She committed suicide last Christmas. I was the one who found her. Oh, God! Does Anton still live here? I asked. Yes. He goes to the cemetery every day to visit her grave. He's on some kind of medication. He tells everyone he's crazy. We watched the rain splash on the window box and cried over our losses until we could cry no more. Mother got up and made tea. She let the tea steep a while before saying, "You do have one friend left. Remember Harold?" I did, but we never had much in common. I went to see him that night anyway. On my walk over to his mother's apartment, I remembered his anger when the army rejected him because of his tuberculosis. His family was less well off than ours, which was probably why he had TB in the first place. His schooling was interrupted several times when he was sent off for treatment at sanitariums in the cold mountain air. Harold was surprised to see me. He asked me into their humble abode and said, "I wish they would have bombed this place. Then we could have a nice apartment." I looked at his mother and thought, "You can't mean it." Harold had never known the fear of battle or the anxiety of imprisonment, yet he was far more angry and agitated than I. From my point of view, he was well off. He was healthy now and employed as an engineer. While his good-natured mother served us tea, Harold fussed and complained about the brainless management of his department and the idiotic way that the British were restoring the city. When I got home, I exploded. "What's the matter with Harold? He doesn't know how lucky he is." "He's a perfectionist. He wants everything his way. He's always been like that. His mother told me that he wears an expensive English bathrobe to their outdoor privy," Mother said with a smile. "At least we have plumbing that works." My visit to my old friend made me feel worse. How could he ignore the suffering around him? My face must have shown it. "I'm so grateful that you and Erica lived through the war and came back without serious mental or physical injuries. I don't care about Harold or anything else," Mother said, in a gentle reminder of priorities. "Germany is in worse shape than I imagined. How will we ever recover?" I wondered. Today, returned POWs such as myself would probably be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and treated at a veterans' hospital. Back then, we had to come to grips with losses of friends, relatives, and the destruction of our homeland. We were supposed to get back to work as if nothing had ever happened. I felt morose. The endless rains and fogs of Kiel did nothing to assuage my angst. On the first Sunday I was home, Uncle Willy came to visit. Fortunately for him, he never risen high enough in the Social Democrats to be arrested by the SS. Willy was bone-thin, bent, and prematurely aged, but he had not lost his fire over politics. When I heard him getting worked up over government policies again, I realized how much he and Uncle Hanny had influenced me. They had never kowtowed to the Nazis. Their independent voices echoed in my head during my years as a soldier and a prisoner. Because they didn't swallow everything they heard, I didn't either. Willie and Mother talked about the damage to our old neighborhood. Nothing had been rebuilt. People are still living in the undamaged parts of our old building. I didn't tell you yet about St. Matthew's Church, Haino. A bomb hit the roof, fell to the floor below, and completely burned out the interior. Images of the cross, pipe organ, hand-carved altar, pulpit, and the pews we once inhabited flitted through my mind. Once it was our sanctuary, now it was ashes. "I don't know if it will ever be restored," Mother said. "People don't go to church like they used to." The thought of the destruction of that beautiful old church, as well as our depressing situation, gave me a headache. Hitler's epoch was far from over. "I need some air. Let's go for a walk." We headed toward a neighborhood park. I was surprised to see a lot of stumps. "What happened to those trees?" I asked my dad. "They've been gone for a long time now," he said. "Several winters ago, when a coal shipment didn't arrive in the city, no one could heat water or cook, let alone heat their apartments. I told your mother, I hate to tell you this, but the trees are disappearing from the city parks. We haven't been able to catch anybody in the act." He scrunched up his forehead in a frown. I could tell that he was working up to something unpleasant. "Before the trees are all gone," I told her, "get the able-bodied neighbours together so that we can take our share." So I stood there like a sentinel in my police uniform while they cut down and made off with a tree. After that, when the coal shipments failed, we went back and got another one. I tried to hide a smile. I could hardly believe that my father had broken the law. In Germany there was a law to cover every contingency, and he knew every one of them. All of our relatives poked fun at him behind his back because of his fondness for quoting laws. As children, Erica and I mimicked him by making up new laws and telling each other, "You can't do that. According to Section D, Article 8, throwing paper airplanes or paper dolls off the balcony on Sundays is not permitted." There should have been a law against making newly released captives go right back to work. After a week back home, Mother said, "Hey, no, you're going to have to report to the Labour Office." Registering for work was a requirement to get ration coupon books. "I don't want to get a job so soon," I said. My mind and body cried out for rest. "You must. I need your ration card to get enough food for you," Mother said. Ration cards were issued to every man, woman and child in both Germany and America during the war, although America's rations were much more generous. Card holders were eligible for a booklet issued each month with coupons for each product, including coffee. Germans loved their coffee, and my family was no exception. Coffee stimulated us to get moving, no matter how thin and tired we were. The German government made a concession to the inhabitants of heavily bombed cities and distributed real coffee. Kiel was one them. The rest of the citizenry got ersatz coffee made of roasted grain. Ration booklets were as necessary as money in our kaput country. Even though my mind said no, I dragged my body to the dreaded Labour Office. Former POWs were already standing in line. I learned that my fate had by no means been the worst. Russia had sent some of the POWs home when they were starving, close to death, and unable to work. Against all odds, they recovered. They told their terrible personal stories and swapped rumours. A skinny little guy in an old ragged uniform said, "Tell the officials when you get a work assignment that you don't have any clothes except what you're wearing. Then you don't have to take the job." I don't know where he got that information. Perhaps the Labour Office took pity on the abused POWs from Russia and gave them a well-deserved rest. I waited in line for my work assignment. When my turn came, I looked at the well-nourished official across the desk. Years of frustration and anger welled up in me. Impulsively I asked, "Where did you spend the war?" Instead of the subdued, obedient German boy I had been when I left, I was snotty and sarcastic. I pointed at his jacket and blurted out, "I think I can see the spot where you wore the golden German Nazi Party badge." What a fiasco! I could tell from his reaction that I was destined to work on a road gang again. He assigned me to a crew that removed rubble and shoved it on loading cars. Temporary narrow tracks for these cars had been laid down all over the city and led to the harbour where the contents were dropped onto barges. Then they were emptied into the Baltic Sea. This was a job for machines, not men. I felt totally discouraged and deflated. After using my wits to get out of road gangs in America, I had come full circle and faced hard labour again. I had gotten too cocky on my home ground. Why didn't I just shut up? That same day, another POW told me a rumour that the British Labour Office was looking for an English speaker. Boy, I hoped it was true. I raced over there at top speed and applied. Mr. Thompson, a retired RAF group captain, interviewed me. His rank was equivalent to a US colonel. He was now the British resident officer in charge of almost all activities in Kiel, the new state capital of Schleswig-Holstein. He and his staff had a formidable job. A diorama of the city would demonstrate the problem most clearly. Kiel's major roads, city streets, bridges and railways were destroyed, as well as over half of the apartments and houses. Trucks spasmodically distributed the meagre food supply. A steady influx of refugees from former German areas such as East Prussia, Pomerania and Silesia settled in Kiel. Former foreign labourers and POWs who did not want to return home and live under communism squatted in refugee camps for displaced persons, DPs. The newcomers doubled our population and exacerbated the problem. The British had taken on the responsibility to dole out living space and food equally, and at the same time get the city to function again. Mr. Thompson was up to the task. The epitome of a British officer and a gentleman, he was tall, slender, and wore a moustache. He told me that his eye was blinded in one of the air battles he fought during World War I. In World War II, he lost a son in combat. The interview felt fairly comfortable, since I had been dealing with British officers in less favourable circumstances. Hoping to impress the decorous Mr. Thompson, I told him about my POW experience in America and in Scotland. Our talk ranged over the history of Kiel and the political situation. When he told me, "I'm hiring you as a translator for the British Control Commission for Germany, CCG," I couldn't have been happier. Mr. Thompson pulled himself up to his rigid posture as I rose to leave. His one good eye looked at both of mine as he said, "Ericsson, do get rid of that awful American accent." That was a tall order. I was fast talker with a German/pseudo-Southern accent. When I reported for work the next day, I tried to wrap my tongue around my old British accent. For the next 6 years, I had the privilege of working and cooperating with dedicated German and British staff, officials, and the military. Our office was in 2 rooms on the first floor of a beautiful Spanish-style villa that had been requisitioned by the occupation. The mansion was shared between Mr. Thompson and a colonel of the British police who was technically in charge of the German police of the city. So far, they had only Ellen Schwartz, a pretty brunette with a college education, on staff. She was already married. Ellen usually interpreted for dignitaries. She was so busy that I was also called upon to interpret. Both of us translated the correspondence to the British authorities. My daily task was to read and translate all the local newspaper articles concerning policies of the occupation or the Western Allies. If there was opposition by German elements, the British wanted to know so that they could educate them. Their goal was to instill democracy as well as to rebuild the country. An assignment I hated was to attend and report on political meetings. Any political gathering required a permit from our office, citing the type of meeting as well as the time and the place. That was my cue. I listened in on their political diatribes and communist mummery. It made me feel like a spy. At the end of each meeting, invariably held at night, I had to find my way home in the dark, hoping that no one was following me. Kiel's streetlights hadn't functioned since the Blitz. My father gave me a police tear gas pistol for my protection, which fortunately I never had to use. Returning home alone, often in milk-soup fogs, took some bravery, yet I never dared complain to Mr. Thompson, who had faced so much danger and loss. During my first year with the British, they increased the office staff with 2 more Germans who didn't speak English. Olhoff, a pleasant cooperative guy from East Germany, was our clerk. Anderson was local, an overbearing extrovert, and took over as political reporter. I was relieved that I didn't have to attend the meetings, but I still had to interpret Anderson's long, biased harangues. That was almost as bad. Once a week, I had to take the night shift at the British police headquarters around the corner. I was given a cot, but told to keep my clothes on, because I was on call for emergencies that required an interpreter. My shift got exciting one night when headquarters was on alert for a raid at a huge displaced persons DP camp. My father had told me previously that the police were trying to find culprits who were stealing monthly UNRWA, United Nations Relief Association, packages. Whenever the police raided the black market, they discovered food, soap, and cigarettes from UNRWA. German police had already surrounded the camp when I arrived. On orders of the British officer in charge, I entered with several guards. Every barrack was searched. The police were not surprised at the enormous pile of boxes stamped UNRWA that they finally collected. A policeman brought the perpetrators to me in an interrogation room. As I questioned them individually, I learned that they were waiting to immigrate to the US, Canada, Australia, or any other country that would take them. After I finished relaying their answers to the investigator, he told me to go back to headquarters and added with a grin, "The black market lost a lot of customers tonight. No one ever told me what happened to the DPs. I was glad it was over. Kiel Week, the best week of the year, was coming up. The traditional week of regattas and other water sports that began in Imperial Germany were held again. Initially, it was on a very small scale. Later on, the British Navy brought a delegation from Coventry to meet with the mayor and the city director every year. Both Kiel and Coventry had been among the most heavily bombed cities. They formed ties to overcome the past and explore the best ways to rebuild their cities. Ellen and I went along as their interpreters. Sometimes the meetings were held in a naval destroyer or cruiser at anchor. At other times, they took us out to sea for meetings in patrol boats. By noon, Ellen and I were famished and smiling brightly at the stewards. Strict rationing kept us in a constant state of calorie deprivation. Stewards politely served us. The delegation kept us so busy talking that we could only sneak little bites. Mr. Thompson always admonished me before we left the office, "Ericsson, don't talk with your mouth full." And before I knew it, a steward would whisk away my plate of glorious, wonderful-smelling food. What a gut-wrenching loss. Another part of my job involved our local hero and near martyr Andreas Geik, the new mayor of Kiel. Geik, a social democrat and former member of the German parliament, resumed a leadership role upon his return from Scandinavia. 3 conflicting plans give Mayor Geik the biggest headache under his administration. One was the Morgenthau Plan, which called for the destruction of the rest of Kiel's industrial base. Docks and shipyards were to be demolished. At the same time, Geik assisted with the Marshall Plan, funded by the United States. Officials from Coventry, England, met with municipal officials from Kiel for the purpose of rebuilding their bombed-out cities. Germany had bombed Coventry as heavily as the British had bombed Kiel. The third administrative task was a lengthy process for transferring British control of the municipal, county, and land administration back to the German government. German staff had to build an esprit de corps to strengthen morale. In order to keep our jobs, we had to translate the plans and act as if we accepted England's post-war policy of destroying the rest of our harbour. For example, Kiel's docks were blown up in step-by-step explosions. Then sand was brought in by barges to make beaches where the docks once stood. To us, the docks were an integral part of Kiel and of our lives. They had been there before we were born. We had gone to the docks since babyhood for trips across our peninsular city. But we had to hide our dismay. During these explosions, evacuation of nearby houses was required because of the danger to structures already weakened by 5 years of bombings. We felt the anguish of tenants like my mother, who was as physically weakened as the buildings themselves. Sirens went off, and everyone had to head out of the neighbourhood, just like they went to the concrete air raid shelters before. You could hear mutterings of, "Quatsch! Mensch!" The British tried to blow up the air raid shelters too. Some were so well made that they only developed cracks. Later, they were patched and used for commercial and residential purposes. Kiel's city director reported to my British boss weekly. He violently opposed the razing. They had heated arguments over this imbroglio. The mayor remonstrated too, and was ignored, since the orders from London had to be carried out. My heart was not in my interpretations of the British orders, but my job demanded that I relay them. A few years after my job with the British began, they toned down their occupation role, cut down the number of soldiers stationed in Germany, and replaced their uniforms with well-tailored English suits. Mr. Thompson even took German lessons. He was a quick learner, too quick. On several occasions, Mr. Thompson caught me softening his remarks. "Ericsson, when I say it stinks, I don't want you to say it smells." The austere Mr. Thompson was strict and formal with me until the day he invited the staff to celebrate his birthday on the second-floor living quarters of the mansion. The English were fond of gin and poured it liberally that day. I didn't like the taste of liquor, and I didn't drink it. That day I was served the 1 bowl of soup and 1 slice of bread we were given for lunch, and as usual I was still hungry. The Pink Lady cocktails they kept serving tasted like fruit punch and whirled me into an exuberant mood. By the time the birthday cake was served, I was probably giggling. I started playing around and offered cake to the passers-by below. I threw slices of cake out the window to them. Mr. Thompson must have seen me let myself go, but he didn't say a word. After that, though, if we were attending an event where liquor would be served, he would hold back a smirk and say sternly, "Eriksson, don't drink too much." I never did it again. I didn't want to make him mad, because this was the best job I could possibly get. The Brits even served us lunch, meagre though it was, so that we could save our precious ration coupons. My boss even went out of his way to make up for the paucity of our food supply by providing some protein. He went hunting. In Germany, hunting had always been the exclusive preserve of the upper class, whose estates sheltered deer. Here was meat on the hoof, and we had no way to get at it, since all hunting weapons had either been turned in, confiscated, or buried. Mr. Thompson let us know that the occupation had been granted the privilege to hunt for game. My boss, even with only one eye, was a crack shot. He usually bagged 2 deer. One he gave to the Wounded German War Veteran Association. The other he shared with his staff and the British police colonel with whom he shared the upstairs apartment. With the meat, the British cooked many meals of slumgullion, a venison, potato, and vegetable stew, while German chefs made many appetizing dishes, including a wild Brett pastate, a tart of mushrooms, onions, and spices, a luxurious dish like ambrosia to those of us who often had food dreams. Our family felt fortunate to be living in our own apartment, even if it needed glass for the windows and was in dire need of plastering. We felt blessed to have enough food coupons to eat 3 small meals a day. My family was better off than most because my father and I had good jobs. Many were not as fortunate. Fathers and brothers never came home. Their love, companionship, protection, and economic support were irreplaceable. Often, when a father long thought dead was released from a foreign POW camp and found his family, he discovered that his wife had a new husband. The children were torn between loyalty to their birth father and the man who had taken his place. Society in post-war Germany was full of impulsive choices, hastily made relationships, broken hearts, and a toughness that came out of dealing with danger and chaos. An amazing story of love and survival happened around this time. An elderly German POW who was taken prisoner in Russia during World War I had been held in Siberia. He was semi-free to move about in his surroundings, like many political prisoners, and in so doing he had learned Russian. When the first German POWs from World War II arrived, he learned what was going on in the world. He escaped and followed the advancing Red Army all the way into Berlin, which was to be occupied by Russia. At a document check, he was arrested. He admitted his story to an interrogator who felt sorry for him and told him to go home. He made his way to Kiel and found his wife, who had never remarried. It made the headline in the local paper. For a young person like myself, creating a social life outside of work was difficult. Males had lost most of their contemporaries. Females had lost their innocence. They suffered through bombings, starvation, and all sorts of hardships. They were not the happy, laughing girls we dreamed about in POW camp. Many of them had to learn survival skills or perish. Others assessed the opportunities that came along and used them to their advantage. Survival consumed the thoughts of girls my age. I was just another POW. Handsomely turned out British soldiers in the occupation had a lot more to offer. I didn't expect to find a girl who would give me a second look for a very long time. But about 18 months after my repatriation, Quist, a former POW from Fort Knox, looked me up. Even though he was born in a nearby town, we had nothing else in common. Finding Quist at the door startled me, because he came from the last barrack I was assigned to, the one where SS congregated. He was a huge, intimidating figure. When I left Fort Knox, he asked for my address. I copied it down just to get away from him. I had no intention of seeing him again. As I expected, he was in the last groups to leave American and British prison camps because of his SS identification. But back in Germany, Quist was just another clerk in a wholesale fish market. Perched awkwardly on the sofa in my parents' home, he was shy, quiet, brooding. Away from that barrack of Nazis, it was hard to imagine him in the SS. At any rate, I didn't talk about my military experience because I didn't want to hear about his. Quist wanted to be my friend so much that he had come over just to invite me to his office party. He was certain that I would be interested, because samples of the market's fish products would be served, and the female clerks stayed as long as the food lasted. There I met my first girlfriend. She told me that her father was a teacher, but he was either dead or a POW in Russia. Her mother was devastated and was never the same. I took her home to meet my parents. She was thrilled with their warmth and generosity. Later, I realized that we represented a stability that she had lost. Within a year, we were married. I had been living in a small upstairs bedroom in my parents' bombed-out building. My one shattered window was covered with plexiglass that rattled and rasped when it was windy or rainy. Now I needed more room and better windows. Fortunately, my job with the British and my bit of influence with German authorities gave me enough prestige to sublet 2 rooms of a 4-room apartment rented by another tenant. The following year, the British helped me get a larger apartment, though still with a shared bath, when my son Jorg, a big, blonde, perfectly healthy baby, was born. My family was happy to have another new life emerge in the midst of rubble and ruins. Unfortunately, we were still labouring with shortages of food, clothing and housing. Kiel, in peacetime, still bore the signs of a city under siege. We were not prepared for what happened next, even though we knew that the Nazis had printed worthless Reichsmarks to finance the war. Everyone but hoarders had ignored rumours of a currency reform. So when a Sunday night radio broadcaster announced, "And now an important announcement from Bonn, the present currency will be invalid by midnight," I was stunned. The announcer went on, "Tomorrow you will be able to exchange no more than 400 Reichsmarks, RM. They are now worth 40 Deutschmarks, DM," he continued. "Savings accounts will be devalued next." This was going to affect pensioners and other honest folks who had saved their money, since the rest of their accounts would just be written off. Because I had a lot more than $400 RM, I headed out the door to see how the rest of Kiel was handling the news. In shop windows, owners arranged hoarded items in their windows. As I bumped into acquaintances, I lit their cigarettes with my hard-earned RM in a show of bravado. The peace really had been terrible. Toward the end of the war, I heard older POWs mutter, "Enjoy the war, the peace will be terrible." At the time, I thought they were expressing fear of reprisals for German atrocities. Once back home, I saw that there was no end to problems caused by the Nazis. They had spawned their evil like poisoned toadstools that unpredictably multiplied and erupted. The introduction of the Deutschmark in the West led to the creation of the German Democratic Republic in the East, with a separate currency. One benefit of the currency reform was that it wiped out the black market. The other benefit revealed itself more slowly. The economy stabilized. Items that had previously been unavailable began appearing in shops. Fortunately, I was high on the government pay scale. We could afford to purchase food, clothing, and furniture. We even took a vacation to the Rhineland. Life in Germany was gradually getting better. Slowly, the responsibility of governing Germany was being returned to the Germans, at least in the 3 western zones of occupation, called in jest Trezone Sia. The municipal bodies and newly created states had existed as the only self-governing bodies under the Allied Control Commission for Germany. A federal structure with limited authority was created in 1949. High commissioners replaced the military governors. In 1952, a treaty restored full sovereignty. Paradoxically, the peace we had been counting on, had built on, did not last. The Korean War exploded on the scene, and many of us feared that it might extend to Europe and escalate into World War III. Ironic rumours of German rearmament under the European defence community, the forerunner of NATO, were abundant. This was incredible. From total German disarmament, including a ban on the manufacture of toy soldiers, to rearmament. Apparently, bodies were needed again for a new war. Demonstrations were common, especially by German students carrying signs and shouting, "Ohne mich," without me. Former POWs felt nonplussed. Many of them started talking about immigrating to North America. Canada offered immigration, but the jobs available were only for men to work in the woods as lumberjacks. Mulling over the idea, I thought that I might be able to save enough of my wages to pay for my family's immigration later. But there was no way to know how long that would take. I couldn't stand the thought of living like that again. I attended Spanish language class until I heard that many Nazis had found a safe haven in Latin America. I had not forgotten my problems with them in POW camps. Australia beckoned, but it seemed too far away for return visits to relatives. The United States was on my list, but I doubted that I would ever get back to America, since the United States had passed a new security law barring persons who had been members of Nazi organizations. This seemed terribly unfair. Membership in the Hitler Youth had been compulsory since 1934. Eventually, I heard that the immigration laws eased to exclude only the former SS and Nazi organizations condemned during the Nuremberg trial. I thought of Walter, my friend from the POW camp in Fort Knox. I wondered how he was faring. He had immigrated to Minnesota with the help of relatives who had lived there for generations. He and his mother and sister had become our friends when they ended up in Kiel as refugees. Walter had promised to help me and to sponsor me after he had established himself in Minneapolis, Minnesota. After corresponding with Walter, I applied to the waiting list for immigration to the United States of America. Finally, in 1953, my number came up. 6 years of providing English-German language assistance in the rebuilding of my hometown had come to a close. Once the reconstruction was completed, my position would be phased out anyway. I had done my best for my city and for my country, and I was ready for a new life. With Walter's sponsorship and my payment of our sea passage on the Holland-America line, the trip was confirmed. Parting from my family just 6 years after my long absence during the war was not easy. However, I thought this was the best decision for the future. The goodbyes at the railway station finally ended with a lot of tears and handkerchiefs when the train pulled out. Auf Wiedersehen, auf Wiedersehen. Until we meet again, I vowed. Tschüss, tschüss. Mother, father, Erica, and the rest of my relatives stood on the platform and cried. I held back the tears while I made up my mind to return for a visit as soon as I could afford it. Crossing into Holland was uneventful, yet Rotterdam still showed the marks of heavy German bombing from the earlier years of World War II. The Dutch were understandably prejudiced against Germans. They either glared at us or ignored us. The same was true on the ocean liner with its all-Dutch staff. We stopped in Le Havre, France, and in Southampton, England, before crossing the North Atlantic to Canada and finally to New York. In the last crossing, we hit a few days of really rough seas. Since I was the only person in the dining room, the ship steward and I began to talk and to listen to each other. Our exchange of ideas and philosophies fostered a friendship. At least one of the crew liked me. Finally, the Statue of Liberty hove into view again. This time I felt welcome. Immigration officials came aboard to check the documents. One official said, "Have you ever been imprisoned or deported from the United States?" "Yes, to both counts." The officer looked at me strangely. What had I blurted out wrong this time? I tried to explain. I was a German POW, and I was deported in 1946. "That was not a deportation, that was a repatriation," the officer snapped. "Just answer the questions." Finally, on solid ground again, we cleared immigration and customs and found Walter. He had a new Kaiser Frazer automobile to take us on our long drive to the Midwest. States I had only heard about lay ahead on our trip: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and finally Minnesota, where I was convinced that I could create a comfortable life for my new family. Hard work, planning, and perseverance had brought me back to a land where I believed anything could be achieved if you had enough stamina, discipline, and drive. I was a 29-year-old family man with $10 in my pocket, some household goods, and a Protestant work ethic that wouldn't quit. In my enthusiasm, I forgot that Uncle Sam had provided for my basic needs in exchange for my labor. I had no idea of the pitfalls that lay ahead. Former four-star General Dwight D. Eisenhower was President of the United States. Richard M. Nixon was Vice President. The country was in the midst of a post-war boom. More houses built, more cars produced, more college graduates, and more babies birthed than ever before. 1953. The room reeked of burnt rubber. Pain sizzled my flesh before I smelled the scorch of my shirt. Another burn scar to add to my collection, I thought. Someone was shouting my name. "Erickson, the steward wants to see you." I turned from the red-hot iron mould full of melted rubber gaskets and took off my apron. "They're probably going to fire me for spending too much time at the first aid cabinet," I joked to the guy next to me. Co-workers on the night shift at Schmidt Rubber Gasket Company in Minneapolis made room for me to walk behind them. About 40 unskilled men, including some World War II vets, were working on their hot moulds, but not getting burned as often as I did. The shop steward was waiting for me in his office. He leaned back in his chair and glared at me. "This is a closed shop. After 30 days, you have to join the union or get laid off." To make small talk with this officious guy was impossible. "Really? No one told me that before. I have to think about it," I said as I turned around and left. Another snafu. My mind searched for a way out. I didn't know much about labor unions in the United States, but I had read news articles in the Minneapolis Tribune about this one. The leadership was communist. Next morning, I worriedly called the FBI to make certain that I wouldn't be deported if I joined. The guy on the other end laughed at me. "If you need to join to keep your job, no problem." On the other hand, deportation didn't sound so bad. Several months before, I had given up an excellent job in Germany to live in the land of the free. After weeks of interviews with every company that advertised for accountants or merchandiser buyers, I saw that my letters of reference and education counted for nothing. Employers didn't want to take a chance on a guy, with foreign credentials and an accent. Gainful employment looked hopeless until my friend and sponsor, Walter, told me that he heard about a company that needed more help. "Don't worry, they'll take almost anybody." That hurt. But they had hired me immediately for the smelly job. In a few short weeks, I had saved enough money from my salary to rent a duplex. My landlord, a salesman, had married a German war bride, and they treated us like relatives when we moved in. My landlord even found me a different job, as a salesman for the Ibert Coffee Company. Walter had let me drive his Kaiser Frazer, but now I needed my own car to cover my sales route. He helped me pick out a trustworthy 1946 Oldsmobile, which I drove from door to deliver coffee, tea, and coffee makers. This was back when most married women stayed home with their children, and they had time to make coffee and chat in the kitchen with salesmen. The wives gave me an introduction to typical American family life. This was exactly how I wanted my family to live someday. As the Christmas holidays drew closer, I enjoyed the sight of decorations and the smell of freshly baked Christmas cookies. At the same time, the burden of my war experiences rose to the forefront of my consciousness. Angst compelled me to kindle my dad's annual ritual in the New World. As a soldier during World War I, he had carried a collapsible miniature Christmas tree with candles. In a trench somewhere in France on Christmas Eve, he lit the candles and sang carols with his buddies. By the end of the war, his heart was heavy with the deaths of close friends killed in battle. Each year, on a quiet night before Christmas, he played carols, lit the candles on his little tree again, and let the angst descend. As a child, when I found him sitting in the dark with tears rolling down his face, I asked, "What are you doing, Daddy?" "I'm sad right now." "Can I be sad with you?" "Of course, sit here by me." We would stare into the flames. My only sadness was that Christmas, with its sweets and toys, was still days away. My father's sadness went so deep that I longed to comfort him. His eyes reflected a list of dead friends filed away in his memory. He opened the file on this occasion in order to honour them one by one. When I returned from captivity, I joined him in his Christmas ritual again, this time with pangs of my own. Now I had a list to grieve over. Visions of my fallen classmates, soldiers, and fellow captives, and tidbits of our banter surfaced in my mind. I let myself feel anguish over their deaths again, as I prayed for their eternal souls. When I lit their candles for the first time in the new world, I knew I would keep this ritual to honour their memories for the rest of my life. My 5-year-old son Jorg asked me the same question I had asked my father. "What are you doing, Daddy?" I told him that a lot of Germans get melancholy at Christmas, while I inwardly hoped that he would never have to cope with a survivor's sense of loss and guilt. He had taken the move to the United States in stride until Christmas packages from home arrived. Then he wanted to know why we couldn't get in the car and go visit his grandparents, Oma and Opa, and his cousin Helga. Although we were in America, I carried on the Christmas traditions. For the first time, I made my own Advent wreath, and on Christmas Eve I gave my son the same treat I got as a boy. I decorated the Christmas tree in secret and showed it to him while candles on metal holders clipped to the boughs blazed in glory for a few precious moments. In our neighbourhood, I saw various European ethnic groups reach back into their cultures to celebrate religious holidays. My son enjoyed the holiday spirit and gifts more than anyone else. He was content. He liked his daycare providers and the little job I gave him. He helped me shelve the Ibert boxes. Root salesmen like myself kept products in their basements. One day, the Ibert men came to my house and said they were taking an inventory. Afterwards, they gave me a slip to sign and left. I gasped when I read it. I hereby voluntarily resign from the Ibert Coffee Company. Slick move. With my resignation, they wouldn't have to pay unemployment compensation, since my signature made me ineligible. Jobless again, I complained about my treatment to Union Hall, where a union steward hired me right away. He looked me straight in the eye. "All you have to do is make a weekly visit to this list of bars and nightclubs that I'm going to give you. Collect an envelope from each one and immediately seal it shut if it's not already closed. Got that? This is an important job. I'm counting on you." The job seemed easy enough, even though I had to drive around at night to unfamiliar places. Some of the bars were dark, seedy dives where only men hung out. They were nothing like the well-lit family-style bars we had in Germany. I noticed right away that some owners seemed angry, others seemed afraid. Yet among the shipping clerks, I never felt anything but a little teasing over my accent or one of my cultural blunders. However, it took the company 12 years to move me up to a management level, and then only because I broke my leg on the job and couldn't work in the warehouse. They started me as an internal auditor and promoted me several times to my final position as assistant merchandiser buyer. Nevertheless, with careful money management, I was able to realize the American dream 3 years after Midland hired me. I bought a new ranch-style home in the suburbs and a new car. One of the proudest days of my life occurred 5 years after my immigration. Immigrants prepared themselves for citizenship by studying American history and government. When I heard that I passed the test the first time I took it, it meant everything to me. At my hearing, a judge reviewed my paperwork, looked over his bifocals and asked, "Heinrich Richard Max Eriksson, why do you have so many names?"